A black Bentley eased to a stop in front of Alder House, right in the middle of the afternoon check-in rush, and Derek Halstead stepped out, removed his sunglasses, and looked toward the revolving doors where Calvin Pierce was standing. He did not wait for an introduction. "You. Take these bags up to my suite." A young bell attendant started forward out of habit, and Derek raised a hand without even glancing at him. "I said him." Calvin did not react. He simply set his hand on the handle of the first suitcase, the way he had set his hand on thousands of suitcases before it, and at that exact moment Margaret Sloane came almost running across the lobby floor. "Calvin, I have been looking everywhere for you." She took hold of his arm. "Victoria Benton just called. She said the entire leadership team will not begin the briefing until you are in the room." Derek turned slowly and looked again at the man he had just ordered to carry his luggage. And what unsettled him was not the mistake itself, but the question rising underneath it. Why would an account worth nearly $2 million a year depend on the judgment of a 72-year-old concierge? If you believe experience only reveals its true value under pressure, stay with Calvin until the end of this story. Calvin Pierce had worked inside the walls of Alder House for 47 years, long enough that he could walk the length of the lobby with his eyes closed, and know exactly where the marble seams had worn smooth under decades of footsteps. He had started as a bell attendant at 25, moved into the night porter's rotation not long after, spent a stretch of years as a guest services agent, answering the same handful of questions 1,000 different ways, and had only become concierge once the hotel finally understood that the position needed someone who could hold an entire building's worth of relationships in his head without ever losing his footing. He was not a secret shareholder hiding behind a uniform. He did not own any part of the hotel, and he had no quiet fortune tucked away that might one day explain his calm. What he had instead was a set of instincts sharpened over nearly 5 decades. The ability to notice a need a guest had not yet put into words, an exact sense of where personal attention ended and intrusion began, and a reputation among the staff that he had never once spent by making someone else look small in order to make himself look necessary. He was, by his own private accounting, roughly a year away from retiring for good, and the thing that kept him awake some nights was not the fear of being replaced. It was the fear that the hotel, in its rush towards something newer, might quietly confuse two very different ideas, replacing a person and erasing an entire kind of skill that no software update would ever be able to reconstruct once it was gone. Calvin turned to Marcus Hill, the bell captain, and asked him, in the same even voice he used for every request, to take Mr. Halstead's luggage up to the presidential suite. There was no edge in it, no flicker of resentment at having been mistaken for staff several ranks below his own. And Derek, watching this, felt a small and unfamiliar surprise, because the older man clearly had no need to prove anything about his position. Margaret pulled Calvin aside before he could take another step, explaining that Victoria Benton had arrived with 17 senior partners, and that this retreat was different from every one that had come before it, urgent enough that she wanted Calvin present at the briefing personally, rather than delegating it downward. Margaret's voice carried a tension Calvin recognized immediately, the particular strain of someone who had already sensed a client's mood shifting before any actual complaint had been voiced, and Calvin matched her urgency without matching her anxiety, the way he had learned to do decades earlier when he realized that a nervous concierge only ever made a nervous client more nervous still. Calvin asked only 3 questions in return, quick and practical. Was there signage announcing the firm's presence? Had welcome gifts already been placed? Was the company name displayed anywhere on the meeting floor? Margaret answered no to each one, and Calvin nodded once and said simply that he understood, already walking. Derek had caught enough of the exchange to ask Margaret directly why a concierge needed to be involved in something at this level, and Margaret told him, without apology, that Benton and Cruel trusted Calvin. Derek pressed further, noting aloud that an account worth close to $2 million appeared to be resting on the instincts of a 72-year-old employee. And Margaret had no answer for him, because in some uncomfortable sense, he was not wrong. Derek watched Calvin cross toward the private elevators and said, almost to himself, that this was precisely the kind of dependency he had come to Chicago to eliminate, and the sentence connected the quiet tension of the lobby to the larger reason for his visit. Halstead Lodging Group was in the final stages of negotiating an $80 million investment into Alder House, and one of the conditions on the table gave Derek's team direct authority to restructure daily operations, staffing models, and guest systems from the ground up. His preliminary plan, already drafted before he ever set foot in the building, called for reducing the concierge headcount, migrating the majority of guest requests onto a mobile application, centralizing guest profiles into a single searchable database, automating restaurant and vendor reservations, introducing measurable performance metrics, building formal succession plans for every senior role, and cutting the accumulated overtime hours that longtime staff had quietly built into the hotel's operating costs over the years. Calvin sat at the top of a list Derek had already marked in his private notes as high dependency, high retirement risk, not a name flagged for termination, but unmistakably the first position Derek intended to re-engineer. Margaret warned him not to think of Calvin as a line item on a payroll, and Derek answered flatly that he did not see Calvin as a salary at all. He saw him as a single point of failure, a phrase so clean and so reasonable that even Margaret, who had known Calvin for 2 decades, found she could not fully argue against it. Across the lobby, Calvin had reached Victoria Benton, and there was no embrace, no visible warmth performed for an audience, only a brief exchange that Derek happened to overhear from a distance. Victoria said simply, "You remembered," and Calvin answered, "I confirmed." Derek heard the 2 words land differently than he expected, though he did not yet understand why a man who supposedly held an entire career's worth of guest history in his memory would choose the word confirmed over remembered, and the distinction sat unresolved in the back of his mind as the afternoon carried him deeper into the hotel. Calvin's work rarely announced itself through long explanations of a 47-year career, and it was easier, in practice, to understand him through the small decisions he made in a single ordinary hour than through any biography, the kind of decisions that rarely showed up in any performance review but quietly shaped whether a guest left the building, feeling handled or feeling known. A repeat guest checked in that same afternoon, and his profile in the system carried a standing note instructing staff to place a newspaper outside his door every morning at 6. Jenna Cole, the young concierge Calvin had trained personally, moved to follow the instruction exactly as written, and Calvin stopped her with one question: how long had that preference gone unreviewed? The answer was 2 years, and a quick check of the guest's more recent stays showed he now read everything on a tablet before breakfast. Calvin told her plainly to delete the note, and when Jenna asked whether they should not keep the history anyway, he told her that history was useful right up until the moment it started pretending to be permission. A second guest, that same day, an older couple traveling together, asked the desk for a dinner recommendation, and the system immediately surfaced 3 well-reviewed fine dining rooms, known for their reputation rather than their practicality. Calvin asked a few gentle follow-up questions, instead of accepting the algorithm's answer, and it emerged that the husband had recently undergone knee surgery, and the wife did not want him walking any real distance to reach a restaurant. Calvin steered them toward a quiet place a single block away with an elevator and no stairs to navigate, and Derek, who happened to be observing nearby, remarked that 6 questions inside an app could have produced the same result. Calvin agreed without defensiveness, simply saying, "Probably," which was not the answer Derek had expected from a man he assumed would resist any suggestion that technology could replace him. Calvin was not, in fact, an opponent of the tools Derek represented. Years earlier, he had been among the first people at Alder House to push for digitizing the hotel's old paper preference cards, understanding early that automation reduced the kind of small clerical errors that human memory alone could never fully prevent. What he tried, in the small windows of time he had with Jenna, to teach her instead, patiently and without ever making her feel behind for not already knowing it, was a distinction he considered far more important than any software update. Let the system remember the facts, he told her, but you remember the person standing in front of you. Jenna carried that line with her for the rest of the week, turning it over during quiet stretches at the desk, testing it against every interaction she handled. She began noticing how often the system's suggestions were technically correct and emotionally wrong at the same time, a gap she had never quite had language for before Calvin gave it to her. A guest celebrating a work anniversary alone. Traveling without the colleague the system still listed as a companion from 2 years earlier was one of the small moments she caught herself almost mishandling that same week, catching the outdated pairing only because she had started asking, the way Calvin did, what problem the person in front of her was actually trying to solve, rather than what the file said about someone who wasn't there anymore. Derek began quietly shadowing Calvin's shifts not long after, measuring interaction times, the volume of requests handled, labor minutes spent per guest, vendor costs, and conversion rates, treating the older man's day like any other operational process that could be studied and optimized. A third moment from that same stretch of days stayed with Jenna longer than either of the first two. A business traveler named Harold Bishop checked in on a Tuesday evening, a man who stayed at Alder House several times a year and whose profile carried a long list of preferences accumulated over nearly a decade. A corner desk setup, a specific brand of bottled water, an early wake-up call, and a note from 3 years earlier requesting that housekeeping avoid moving the small framed photograph he traveled with. Jenna pulled the note up automatically and prepared to pass the instruction along. And Calvin, glancing over her shoulder, asked whether anyone had verified the photograph was still part of his luggage at all. Jenna admitted she had assumed it was, since nothing in the file indicated otherwise, and Calvin told her that assumption was exactly the gap he wanted her to learn to notice. When Harold arrived at the desk, Calvin greeted him warmly but did not mention the photograph at all, waiting instead until the guest, unprompted, asked whether housekeeping could be told to leave the small frame on his desk untouched. Only then did Calvin confirm the instruction was already in place. Later, once the guest had gone upstairs, Jenna asked why Calvin hadn't simply mentioned it first, since the hotel clearly already knew. Calvin explained that a preference stated first by the hotel could feel like surveillance, while the same preference confirmed only after the guest raised it themselves felt like care. And the difference between the two, though invisible on paper, was the entire difference between a guest who felt anticipated and a guest who felt watched. What Derek found was not entirely flattering to Calvin, and it mattered precisely because it was true rather than invented. Calvin spent a disproportionate amount of time on a handful of repeat guests, whose relationships had never been properly logged anywhere in the hotel's official systems, and at least one long-standing vendor relationship Calvin relied on had no documented backup contact at all, meaning the arrangement existed nowhere except inside his own memory. Derek asked him directly what would happen if he simply did not show up the next morning, how much of what he carried would disappear along with him, and Calvin, without flinching or offering an excuse, answered only, "More than I'd like." It was the first moment in the entire visit where Calvin allowed himself to see his own operation as a liability rather than an asset, and that night, without telling Derek anything about it, he asked Jenna to begin drafting a new internal document, not a private list of guest secrets belonging to him alone, but something he called decision principles. Confirm before personalizing, never expose a sensitive preference, distinguish convenience from privacy, always ask what problem a guest is actually trying to solve, and never use memory as a way to show off. He kept the project quiet from Derek, not out of secrecy, but because he genuinely did not yet know whether the document would prove useful to anyone besides himself. Later that evening, Derek told Naomi Keller, the general manager, that he did not need Calvin gone by morning. He needed the hotel to survive the day after Calvin eventually left, and it was the first sign in the entire story that Derek was not simply wrong about the underlying risk, only wrong about the solution. By the time the initial data review with Naomi had ended, Derek had already moved past the idea of simply observing Calvin from a distance. He wanted a real test, something measurable, something that would settle the question one way or the other before the $80 million investment moved any further along. Derek proposed a 3-day operational pilot, timed to overlap directly with the Benton and Crowell retreat, designed to prove that a major corporate account could be served through an updated guest management system, a dedicated experience team, standardized escalation procedures, and a substantially reduced role for concierge intervention. Naomi agreed to the pilot on the condition that Calvin remain present in the building throughout, and Derek, to his credit, was direct rather than evasive when he told Calvin himself that none of this was personal. Calvin's reply carried more weight than its brevity suggested. Most business decisions are not personal, he said, but the consequences of them always are. Derek then instructed Calvin not to intervene directly with the Benton account, unless specifically asked by Naomi, a request that landed as the first genuinely personal blow of the visit. Since Calvin had managed that particular relationship for more than 20 years, and still he did not push back. Jenna was angrier on his behalf than he allowed himself to be, telling him bluntly that Derek's team was using this exact retreat to prove that he was not needed at all, and Calvin answered her with a line that would return, in different forms, throughout the rest of the story. Don't defend my pride, protect the guest. Jenna wasn't fully satisfied with the answer, and she told him so, arguing that 20 years of careful work on one account deserved more than a quiet step back, the moment someone new decided to take it over. Calvin let her finish before answering, telling her that being right about the account and being useful to the account were not always the same fight, and that he intended to win the second one, even if it meant losing the first for a few days. She didn't agree with him completely, not that afternoon, but she stopped arguing, mostly because she had never once seen his instincts about a guest actually fail. Evan Brooks, Derek's guest experience strategist, was given lead responsibility for the Benton account, and he approached the assignment seriously, pulling every scrap of historical data available. Past visits showed a consistent pattern of floral welcomes, personalized folders bearing individual names, firm signage displayed on the private meeting floor, a specific coffee setup, and a curated private reception menu. All of it verified, all of it accurate to prior stays. Evan had even pulled 3 years of post-stay survey scores to confirm the pattern wasn't a coincidence. Watching satisfaction ratings climb steadily, each time the personalization grew more specific, which only reinforced his confidence that repeating the formula, faithfully and precisely, was the safest possible course of action heading into this particular retreat. Evan had genuinely wanted the assignment to go well, not only because Derek was watching, but because he took real pride in reading a guest's history closely and translating it into a seamless arrival experience, the kind of work he had built his entire career strategy around. He spent the better part of 2 days cross-referencing 5 years of Benton and Crowell visits, building a folder of notes on preferred room temperature, favored appetizers for the private reception, and the exact wording the firm had used in past welcome materials, confident that he was giving Victoria's team the kind of recognition that had clearly pleased them in every previous stay. Nothing in his approach was careless in the way a lazier employee's work might have been. If anything, it was thorough almost to a fault, built entirely on real data rather than guesswork, which was precisely what made the gap so easy to miss. This year, however, Victoria had issued a new and very different directive buried inside the account notes. No public recognition, no company signage, no personalized display until confirmed, and no naming of attendees to anyone outside authorized staff. The instruction existed in the system, but it had been entered as a general comment rather than flagged as a hard restriction, an ordinary clerical gap that would soon prove far more costly than it appeared. Calvin noticed Evan preparing the old personalized materials and warned him plainly to confirm with Victoria before anything left the preparation room. And Evan, not unreasonably, replied that the preferences had already been verified from previous stays. Calvin's answer was quiet but exact. The guest isn't staying in last year. Evan did not dismiss him, arguing instead that if every single preference required manual the entire system would stop functioning as intended. And Calvin told him that his job, then, was to figure out which preferences were actually safe to assume and which were not. A genuine disagreement between two people who both had a point. Derek overheard enough of the exchange to step in and remind Calvin that Evan was running the account now, and Calvin, true to the boundary Jenna had watched him hold all week, simply said, "I know," followed by, "I will," and walked away without protest. Later, when a younger staff member asked him whether the personalized folders should be stopped, Calvin told her only to follow her supervisor, a small but deliberate choice not to undermine the chain of command in order to be proven right. Victoria arrived earlier than expected that afternoon, well before Evan believed everything was fully in place, and from his position at the concierge desk across the lobby, Calvin watched at the personalized signage being carried toward the elevators and said nothing at all. The private meeting floor had been arranged with a modest sign reading Benton and Crowell Executive Retreat mounted inside the corridor rather than the lobby, a placement Evan genuinely believed was discreet enough to satisfy the new directive. The catering team's usual service elevator happened to be under temporary maintenance that same afternoon, forcing vendor staff to reroute through a corridor that ran directly past the private meeting floor. An unremarkable scheduling accident rather than anyone's deliberate mistake. At the same time, a consultant named Grant Wallace, in town for an entirely unrelated conference, and personally acquainted with several senior partners at Benton and Crowell, happened to be staying at Alder House that week, and he passed close enough to the corridor to see the sign without needing a photograph, a phone, or any deliberate act of surveillance. Grant had not gone looking for anything sensitive. He simply happened to be walking back from a meeting of his own. When the sign caught his eye in passing, the kind of detail a person in his line of work noticed almost reflexively, the same way a chef might notice a poorly seasoned dish without meaning to critique it. He thought nothing of it in the moment, filed it away the way a person files away any small, mildly interesting fact about a competitor's movements, and continued on toward the elevator bank without breaking stride. Minutes later, sharing an elevator with one of the firm's partners, Grant remarked casually that he hadn't realized the entire leadership team was in town, and the partner's silence in response told him everything he needed to know about how sensitive the visit actually was. Victoria heard about the encounter within the hour, and her expression changed the moment she understood what it meant. A rival in the same industry now knew her leadership team was gathered together in one place, and even without any knowledge of what was actually being discussed inside those meetings, the mere fact of their presence together was enough to invite speculation about a sensitive deal. She called Naomi directly, her voice controlled rather than raised, and asked her to remove every visible reference to the firm immediately, followed a moment later by a request to have transportation options ready. A phrase that told Naomi exactly what Victoria was quietly weighing. An account worth roughly $1.8 million a year now stood at genuine risk of walking out the door, and Derek arrived on the scene almost immediately, demanding to know who had approved the signage. Evan took responsibility without hesitation, and when Derek asked whether the restriction had existed in the system at all, Naomi confirmed that it had, but had never been properly escalated into a hard rule. Derek glanced across the lobby toward Calvin, and for a moment he clearly did not want to call him over, aware that doing so now would feel like an admission that his entire pilot program had already failed. It was Margaret who made the decision for him, crossing the floor, asking where Victoria was, and turning to Calvin with a single word: "Go." When Derek started to object, Margaret cut him off simply. She asked for him. Calvin did not move immediately even then. He turned first to Naomi and asked whether he was authorized to speak on behalf of the hotel, and only after she confirmed that he did, he walked toward Victoria's suite, a small professional detail that mattered more than it looked, because Calvin never once tried to trade on his own reputation to bypass the authority structure around him, a habit he had held to for so many years that it no longer felt like restraint to him at all. only the ordinary shape of doing the job correctly. He found Victoria packing away her materials, and he did not open with an excuse or an explanation of his earlier warning to Evan. He said only, "We failed your instruction." Victoria answered, "Yes," flatly, without softening it, and Calvin did not argue the point. Instead, he asked her a different question entirely. She did not owe the hotel another chance, but before she made any decision, what did she need in the next 3 hours? It was the first moment since the incident that Victoria paused before closing her laptop entirely. She gave him 4 conditions in return: no company name displayed anywhere in the building, no unapproved staff traffic near the retreat floor, no questions from anyone about whether the group was leaving, and no discussion of compensation until she said otherwise. Calvin repeated each condition back to her once, plainly. Not to demonstrate that he had been listening, but to give her the chance to correct anything he had misheard, a small habit that had served him well for decades in exactly this kind of moment. Victoria did not correct him. She simply watched him for a beat longer than the exchange required, the way a person watches someone they are deciding, in real time, whether to keep trusting. Calvin agreed to each one without hesitation, and as he turned to go, Victoria asked one final question, almost testing him. If anyone asked why her firm was even at the hotel, what would he say? Calvin's answer was simple and immediate: "They won't hear the answer from us." When he stepped back out into the corridor, Derek was waiting, asking what she had said, and Calvin told him only that she hadn't decided to leave yet. Derek asked what had changed her mind, and Calvin answered honestly that nothing had, not yet. What followed over the next several hours was not a solo performance. Calvin began coordinating recovery, but he never once behaved as though the hotel's survival depended on him alone, standing between the guest and disaster. Naomi remained the person with final operational authority, weighing every proposal Calvin brought her rather than simply rubber-stamping it. Jenna took charge of the West Corridor personally. Marcus Hill managed luggage and arrivals. The security supervisor Daniel Reeves adjusted floor access, and Evan quietly reviewed every remaining guest profile connected to the account for anything else that might have slipped through unflagged. Calvin's plan was practical rather than dramatic. Remove the signage entirely, refer to guests by room number instead of company name, reroute catering permanently away from the corridor, pause non-essential housekeeping in the area, instruct staff never to ask about affiliation, and require confirmation before any new personalization was applied to anyone connected to the account. Within the first 20 minutes of the recovery effort, the corridor had already been cleared of every trace of the signage. The catering staff had been redirected through a service path on the opposite side of the building, and housekeeping had been quietly told to stay off the floor entirely unless specifically called. Marcus Hill personally intercepted 2 arriving vendor deliveries that had been scheduled before the reroute, walking each one down a different hallway himself rather than trusting the instruction to reach them through a phone call that might not land in time. Daniel Reeves adjusted the floor's access credentials so that only a short list of approved staff badges would even open the doors nearest the retreat, a change he made without waiting for anyone to ask him twice. None of it looked dramatic from the outside. A guest walking past would have noticed nothing unusual at all, which was precisely the point. When Jenna asked what staff should say if another guest questioned why the corridor was closed, Calvin told her simply to say it was unavailable, and when she pressed, wondering whether they needed a more convincing story, he corrected her gently. Privacy does not require lying. Derek watched the recovery unfold from a short distance and noticed, almost against his will, how quickly everyone fell into step the moment Calvin spoke, prompting him to ask Margaret what formal authority the older man actually held inside the organization. Margaret's answer surprised him. "Less than you think." When Derek asked why then, everyone moved the instant Calvin gave an instruction. She told him. It was because Calvin had spent 47 years making certain that people never regretted trusting his judgment, and for the first time, Derek began to separate credibility from power, understanding that Calvin possessed the former without ever having accumulated the latter. A smaller test arrived not long after, When one of the senior partners called down requesting champagne sent to his room, a request the guest history confirmed was consistent with his usual preferences. Jenna moved to process it automatically, and Calvin stopped her only long enough to ask who had actually made the request. When she confirmed it had come directly from the partner's own assistant, Calvin told her to send it without any further and when Jenna, surprised, asked whether they didn't need to double-check, given everything that had just happened, Calvin corrected her understanding of his own rule. He just did check, in the act of asking. It was, for Jenna, the moment she finally understood that Calvin was not opposed to using guest history at all. Only opposed to using it without knowing whether the context behind it still applied, and Derek, listening nearby, felt something in his own thinking shift slightly for the first time since arriving at Alder House. By late afternoon, Victoria still had not committed to staying, and Derek proposed sending a package of concessions: a $50,000 credit, complimentary suite upgrades, free transportation for the remainder of the visit, and a discount on next year's contract. Calvin told him not to send it yet, and when Derek asked why, Calvin explained that they had not yet asked whether compensation was actually what Victoria wanted from this situation at all. Derek pointed out, reasonably, that she was a business client, and Calvin agreed, saying exactly, meaning that a business client dealt in trust as much as in money, and that offering payment too quickly risked, implying that trust itself carried a price tag the hotel was prepared to negotiate. Derek did not like the answer, but for the first time in the entire visit, he did not dismiss it either, and by the end of the day, Victoria informed Naomi that the retreat would continue through the night, rather than relocate, though the larger question of renewal remained fully unresolved. In the aftermath of the incident, Derek's instincts pulled him toward tighter control rather than looser, and he issued a new set of rules covering the rest of the Benton account. Only specifically authorized staff could interact with the group at all. Every interaction had to be logged. Every request had to be escalated upward rather than handled independently, and no one below management was permitted to make an independent decision of any kind. The goal was reasonable on its face, aimed squarely at preventing a second breach, but the side effects arrived almost immediately and spread faster than Derek anticipated. A front desk associate named Taylor Monroe made the mistake of asking a guest, out of simple habit, whether they were traveling with the Benton group, and a supervisor pulled her aside so sharply that she was visibly shaken for the rest of her shift. Taylor was not the only one who felt the new rules tighten around her that afternoon. A valet attendant hesitated for nearly a full minute before agreeing to bring a guest's car around, worried that confirming the make and model out loud somewhere near the lobby might count as an unauthorized disclosure. A young server in the restaurant stopped mid-sentence while reciting the evening specials to a table near the private floor, suddenly unsure whether describing the menu counted as an interaction requiring a log entry. None of these employees were foolish, and none of them were trying to shirk their duties. They were simply reacting, quite reasonably, to a set of rules that had been handed down without any explanation of where the actual boundary sat, only a clear sense that crossing it in either direction might cost them their job. Word of the incident moved through the staff within the hour, and soon employees across the building were hesitating over ordinary questions they had answered 1,000 times before, escalating small requests to management rather than resolving them, slowing overall service, and quietly pushing every point of responsibility upward rather than owning it themselves. Calvin noticed the shift almost immediately and told Derek directly that he had solved for error and accidentally created paralysis in its place. Derek answered that fear was preferable to a second breach, and Calvin disagreed just as plainly, not in hospitality. When Derek asked what he would suggest instead, Calvin's answer was short: teach them the boundary, don't teach them that the guest is dangerous. Calvin asked for 7 minutes with the staff, and Derek, reluctantly, agreed to it. Standing before roughly 20 employees gathered near the service corridor, Calvin did not deliver a long speech. He told them to do their jobs normally, not to use the firm's name unless a guest used it first, to stop and ask if anything ever felt sensitive rather than guessing, and, above all, not to be afraid of the guest in front of them. A few of the staff exchanged glances when Calvin finished, the kind of quiet relief that comes from finally hearing a rule stated in plain language after a day spent guessing at it. Taylor Monroe, still shaken from earlier, asked one small follow-up question, wanting to know what she should have said instead when the guest first asked about the Benton Group, and Calvin answered her directly, rather than brushing the question aside. She should simply have said she would check, and then checked, the same 3 seconds it would have taken to say the wrong thing instead. It was such a small correction that it barely sounded like one, but Taylor visibly relaxed hearing it, and so did several people standing near her who had been carrying the same unspoken question all afternoon. Derek arrived just as the short talk was ending, and the room went quiet the moment he appeared. But Calvin did not let the silence turn against him. He told the staff plainly that Mr. Halstead was trying to make the hotel better, and that their job was to show him what could not afford to be lost in the process. Derek was visibly caught off guard. Calvin had every opportunity in that moment to turn the entire room against him, and he chose not to. Afterward, alone with Calvin, Derek asked him directly why he had defended him in front of everyone, and Calvin corrected him immediately. He had not defended Derek at all. He had defended the hotel. It was a distinction Derek did not fully understand yet, but one that clearly lodged somewhere in his thinking, because he did not argue with it. Service across the building began to settle back into its normal rhythm not long after, but a new and quieter problem had already surfaced elsewhere in the building. Evan had vanished from the floor entirely, and it was Jenna who eventually found him standing alone in a service corridor, convinced with real certainty that his career at Alder House was already over. Evan told Calvin plainly that he had read the guest's history and genuinely believed he was giving Victoria exactly what she had always valued, and Calvin's response was not what he expected. "You were," Calvin told him, and when Evan looked up surprised, Calvin finished the thought, "for the version of her who stayed here last year." Evan admitted he should have caught the note buried in the system, and Calvin agreed with him plainly, offering no false comfort to soften it. Together they walked back through the entire chain of failure step by step. A historical preference for personalized recognition, a current directive demanding strict confidentiality, and a system with no mechanism at all for distinguishing which preferences were safe to assume and which were sensitive enough to require confirmation first. Evan admitted something else while the three of them worked through the failure together, something he had not said out loud to anyone yet. He told Calvin that part of what made the mistake sting was how confident he had felt walking into it. Certain that thorough research was the same thing as correct judgment, and only now understanding that the two were not always the same. Calvin did not offer him easy reassurance in response, but he did tell him something he clearly meant. The people who never make this particular mistake are usually the ones who never trusted their research enough to act on it in the first place, and that caution came with its own cost, just a quieter one that rarely showed up in anyone's review. Evan turned the accusation on himself once more, wondering aloud whether he had simply been too eager to prove Derek's system could work under real pressure, and Calvin let the question sit unanswered for a moment before saying only that the system, not Evan alone, still had a hole in it that needed fixing regardless of who happened to fall through it first. It was Jenna, not Calvin, who arrived with the actual fix. She proposed sorting every guest preference into 3 tiers going forward. Green preferences, things like pillow firmness, newspaper delivery, or preferred room temperature, could continue to be applied automatically without any friction at all. Yellow preferences, things like gifts, dietary changes, personal recognition, or anniversaries, would always require confirmation before being acted on. Red preferences, covering anything touching companions, medical context, legal matters, or confidential affiliations, could never be triggered automatically under any circumstance, full stop. Calvin looked over her outline and told her honestly that it was better than anything currently in place at the hotel. And Evan added a further refinement of his own, suggesting the system automatically flag any preference as stale after 6 months or a year, without a fresh confirmation, which Calvin approved with a single word: good. When Derek walked in expecting Calvin to demand Evan's termination, he found something else entirely. Calvin telling him simply that they had found the hole in the system. Derek asked who was responsible, and Calvin corrected the framing immediately. Not who, what. He explained the structural flaw in plain terms, and Derek, turning to Evan directly, told him he had still made the decision himself and would still have to own it. A statement Evan accepted without argument. Calvin never once asked Derek to waive accountability on Evan's behalf, a choice that kept the entire episode grounded rather than sentimental, and Derek, in the end, did not fire him, instead assigning Evan and Jenna to build the full revised system together within the week. Alone with Jenna afterward, Calvin told her that the system was finally learning, and when she asked whether it was learning from them, he corrected her once more. It was learning from the mistake itself. By that evening, Victoria had sent word to Naomi that the retreat would run its full course at Alder House after all, though the larger renewal contract, worth close to $3,600,000 over 2 years, remained undecided until the following morning. That night, Derek did not go to bed early. He opened the hotel's operational data again, not because he had begun to trust Calvin, but for the opposite reason, wanting a clear answer to a question he could no longer avoid. Was this man genuinely valuable, or was everyone around him simply attached to him emotionally in a way that clouded their judgment? He pulled repeat guest data, direct booking rates, corporate retention figures, complaint recovery outcomes, ancillary spending, and referral sources from finance, expecting the numbers to confirm his original instinct. What he found instead was a consistent pattern he had not anticipated. Accounts that interacted regularly with the concierge team showed noticeably higher retention, more direct bookings rather than third-party ones, higher food and beverage spending, fewer disputes, and a meaningfully higher rate of referrals, bringing entirely new guests into the hotel. Calvin was not the sole explanation for any of it, but the underlying pattern was impossible to dismiss. Human relationship, sustained over years, was generating measurable financial value that the hotel's existing metrics had never bothered to attribute to anyone. Digging further, Derek discovered that several of the hotel's largest current accounts had originally arrived through personal referrals from earlier guests that Calvin and his team had served years before, connections that existed nowhere in any official report. One account alone, a mid-sized architecture firm that now booked nearly 40 room nights a year, traced back to a single congratulatory phone call Calvin had made to a departing guest's assistant almost a decade earlier, a call that appeared in no spreadsheet, no CRM record, and no performance review, yet had quietly generated more lifetime revenue than several marketing campaigns Derek's own team had run and carefully tracked to the dollar. When he asked Naomi why none of this had ever been tracked, her answer was simple and, in its own way, damning. Because the hotel measured the reservation itself, never the reason a guest chose to come back. She admitted, almost reluctantly, that the gap wasn't Calvin's fault at all. It belonged to a reporting system built years before either of them arrived, one designed around occupancy and revenue targets, that had never once asked a guest why they kept returning, only whether they had returned at all. It struck directly at the center of Derek's own expertise, because the data did not prove that data itself was worthless. It proved that Derek had been measuring the wrong thing from the very beginning. Derek cross-checked the pattern twice before he allowed himself to trust it, running the numbers against a control group of guests who had almost no recorded interaction with the concierge desk at all during their stays. The gap held steady across nearly every metric he tested, and it held even after he adjusted for room type, length of stay, and season, the kinds of variables that usually explained away a pattern like this if it was going to collapse under scrutiny. It did not collapse. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, sitting alone with a laptop and a cold cup of coffee, Derek found himself doing something he had not expected to do on this trip at all. Rewriting his own investment thesis in the middle of the night, not because anyone had asked him to, but because the numbers had quietly stopped agreeing with the plan he had arrived with. The same data also confirmed a real weakness in Calvin's operation, one he had already admitted to himself days earlier. 14 vendor relationships with no documented backup contact anywhere in the system, a number of guest preferences that had gone stale without review, a training process that depended almost entirely on shadowing rather than written procedure, and almost no formal succession documentation for a role that clearly mattered as much as the numbers now suggested. Early the next morning, Derek sought Calvin out, not for a confrontation, but for an honest conversation between two people who had each been partly right. "You were right about the guest," Derek told him, and Calvin answered, "And you were right about me." Derek looked genuinely surprised, and Calvin continued without prompting. If 47 years of knowledge simply walked out the door with him one day, that was not a legacy, that was a failure. Derek sat down, and the two of them spent the next hour redesigning the concierge model together, neither one claiming a clear victory over the other. Calvin proposed that routine requests move fully to automation, that complex requests remain with trained human concierges, that sensitive preferences always require confirmation, that every vendor relationship be formally documented with a backup contact, that staff training center on judgment rather than memorization alone, and that concierge performance be measured through retention, recovery, and guest trust, rather than simple request volume. Derek added his own contributions in turn: expiration dates on every stored preference, documented backup contacts for every key relationship, a formal succession plan, ongoing service analytics, and an anonymous quality review process to catch problems before they became crises. At one point, Derek asked whether any of it felt, to Calvin, like watching his own job get dismantled piece by piece in front of him, and Calvin considered the question honestly, before answering that it felt more like watching a job finally get written down after 47 years of living only inside his memory, which was not the same thing as losing it at all. Calvin agreed to all of it without resistance, and when Derek remarked, almost lightly, that Calvin didn't seem to fight change very much, Calvin's answer carried the weight of the whole conversation behind it. He had been at Alder House 47 years, and change was most of what he had actually seen in that time. Before either of them could say much more, Margaret's phone rang. Victoria wanted everyone in a room together at 9 o'clock the next morning. The meeting room that morning was small, holding only Margaret, Naomi, Derek, Calvin, Jenna, and Victoria herself. And Victoria did not draw out the suspense any longer than necessary. Benton and Crowell would renew for 2 more years, a commitment worth roughly $3,600,000. And Margaret allowed herself a visible breath of relief the moment the words landed, the kind of relief that comes only after carrying an unspoken fear for far too many hours, without letting anyone see the weight of it. Victoria was careful, though, to make one thing unmistakably clear before anyone could misread the moment. They had not stayed because Calvin remembered their names. She looked directly at Derek as she said it. "We stayed because when the hotel made a mistake, he didn't explain why the hotel was right." She laid out 4 specific reasons in turn. Calvin had taken responsibility before offering any explanation. He had asked her directly what she needed rather than assuming. He had worked to restore her sense of control over the situation. And he had never once turned the recovery itself into a performance designed to impress her. Victoria then turned to Jenna and told her plainly that the service the previous day had been excellent, a detail that mattered because it made clear the credit did not belong to Calvin alone. Naomi asked, mostly for the record, and partly to make sure nothing was left ambiguous going forward, whether Victoria wanted anything added to the renewal beyond the standard terms, and Victoria said only that she wanted the account notes rewritten from scratch, this time with every sensitive instruction marked as a hard restriction rather than a general comment, a small procedural request that carried the full weight of everything the past 2 days had cost. Derek said it would be done before the week was out, and he meant it in a way that had nothing to do with appeasing a client he was afraid of losing. Margaret, still visibly relieved, asked whether the firm had any additional feedback on the physical property itself, half expecting a list of complaints about the aging building. And Victoria surprised her by saying there was nothing to add, that the building had never been the reason they stayed in the first place, and had never been the reason they nearly left either. Jenna thanked her, and Calvin looked at her with something close to open pride as Victoria signed the renewal in front of all of them. Afterward, Margaret told Derek that the broader operating agreement between Halstead Lodging Group and Alder House would continue to be negotiated, but that certain terms would have to change from what he had originally proposed. Technology modernization, analytics, succession planning, a full preference audit, and an efficiency review would all remain intact, but the mechanical reduction of concierge headcount, a fully centralized service model, and any plan to evaluate the role solely on request volume were all being removed from the table entirely. Derek did not respond with bitterness. He simply said, "Fair," and meant it. Later that day, the lobby returned to its ordinary rhythm, and Derek noticed Calvin standing near the entrance while a bellman carried his own luggage out toward the waiting car. Derek walked over and addressed him by name for what felt like the first time, with real intention behind it. "When I arrived, I thought carrying bags was your job," he said, and Calvin answered simply, "Some days it is." Derek asked what the other days were for, and Calvin looked out across the lobby before answering, "The other days are why people come back." Derek was quiet for a moment, then admitted something plainly, without performance. "I treated you like a cost before I understood what you were carrying." Calvin recognized the callback for what it was and answered him in kind. "Then understand the job before you try to redesign it." Derek told him he would, and there was no long handshake, no audience, no applause, only a quiet acknowledgement between two men who had genuinely changed each other's minds. 6 months later, Alder House was deep into renovation, and the new guest management system was fully operational across every department. The concierge desk had not been eliminated, only reshaped, with routine requests now handled swiftly through the app and a centralized support line, freeing the human concierges to focus on complex requests, privacy concerns, service recovery, difficult decisions, and the long-term relationships that data alone could never fully replace. Jenna had been promoted to lead concierge, not because Calvin asked for it on her behalf, but because Naomi had watched her performance closely for months and made the decision entirely on her own merit. Evan remained on the guest strategy team, working alongside Jenna to continue refining the preference classification system they had built together in the wake of the crisis. Calvin had cut his own schedule down to 4 days a week, still holding to his plan to retire fully within the year, and a new internal training document had begun circulating quietly through the staff. Someone had wanted to name it the Calvin Pierce Method, and Calvin had refused outright, insisting instead on a simpler title, the Alder House Guest Judgment Guide. Its opening principles read like a distillation of everything he had spent the past several months teaching, without ever framing it as a lesson. Confirm before personalizing, privacy before recognition, context before preference. Own the mistake before explaining it, never make staff afraid of the guest, and memory is never permission on its own. The Guest Judgment Guide had grown beyond its original 6 lines by then, expanded gradually through weekly sessions, where Jenna and Evan brought real situations from the floor, and Calvin helped them work out, case by case, where a preference belonged on the color scale they had built together. New hires were no longer trained by simply shadowing a senior concierge for a few unstructured weeks, though shadowing still mattered. They were also walked through a growing library of real examples, each one stripped of identifying details, showing exactly how a judgment call had been made and why. Naomi had begun tracking retention and referral figures by department for the first time in the hotel's history, and the concierge team's numbers, once invisible inside a single generic reservation count, now stood out clearly enough that even the newest members of Derek's own investment team referenced them without prompting. Derek returned to Alder House for a renovation meeting and made his way to the concierge desk, where Calvin was standing quietly behind Jenna as she walked a new hire through an unfamiliar request. "Mr. Pierce," Derek said. "Dinner recommendation?" Calvin did not step forward. He simply nodded toward Jenna. "Ask her." Derek asked, half joking, whether Calvin was retiring already, and Calvin's answer was plain. "No, she just knows what she's doing." Jenna asked Derek a short series of questions in turn, business dinner or not, quiet or lively, within walking distance, and whether he cared about being recognized while he ate. And Derek paused before answering that last one, understanding immediately, after everything that had happened, exactly why she was asking it. "Tonight?" "No," he told her, and she offered him two options that fit precisely what he needed before thanking him for his time. Derek glanced once more at Calvin before he left, and no further explanation was necessary between them. Calvin had finally accomplished the very thing Derek had originally come to Alderhouse demanding: a meaningful reduction in the hotel's dependency on any single person. He had simply refused to achieve it by removing himself from the equation, choosing instead to pass his judgment forward into the people and the systems around him, so that his absence, whenever it eventually came, would no longer feel like a loss the hotel could not survive. In the final scene, an older guest walked into the lobby after a long flight, visibly worn down by the journey, and a new employee rushed forward immediately, asking whether he was checking in and whether he needed assistance right away. Calvin raised a hand gently, just enough to slow him down. "Give him a second," he said. The guest stood still for a few seconds, caught his breath, one hand resting lightly against the edge of the bell stand, and finally said only that he needed somewhere quiet to sit. The young employee nodded, did not open the app on his tablet, did not ask another string of questions, and simply guided the man to a quiet chair in the corner of the lobby. Calvin watched the exchange from a distance, and Jenna stood beside him, watching the same thing. "You didn't teach him that," she said. Calvin answered, "No." She asked how the young man had known what to do, and Calvin gave her the only answer that had ever really mattered in the entire story. He was paying attention. Calvin allowed himself a small, genuine smile as he said it, because this, finally, was the real payoff of everything that had come before. He no longer needed the hotel to depend on him personally in order to matter. What he was leaving behind was not a private list of important guests, not a hidden network of favors and relationships, and certainly not any formal position of power. What he was leaving behind was a way of seeing people, and for the first time in months, thinking about his own retirement no longer felt like watching a door close behind him. It felt more like watching it stay open for someone else to walk through, which, in the end, had always mattered to him far more than whether his own name stayed attached to any of it. Derek had arrived at Alderhouse, convinced that Calvin Pierce represented a genuine risk, an aging man carrying far too much irreplaceable knowledge inside his own head, with no plan for what would happen when he finally left. In the end, Derek learned he had only been half wrong. Calvin truly should never have been the only person who knew how to do what he did, and on that point Derek had been right from the very beginning. But the answer was never to remove him. The answer was to understand the value he carried deeply enough to pass it on to the people and systems around him before it was too late. Calvin never proved his own importance by positioning himself as the only person capable of saving the hotel in a crisis. He proved it instead by taking responsibility when others tried to place blame elsewhere, by staying calm while the rest of the building was close to panic, by protecting a guest without ever humiliating a colleague in the process, by openly admitting where Derek had been correct, and by helping a younger generation build something better than the very system he had spent his own career mastering. The man Derek once saw as nothing more than someone fit to carry his bags eventually taught him that some things weigh far more than luggage ever could. Trust, judgment, responsibility, reputation. Calvin had carried all four for 47 years, without ever once needing a grander title to prove what he was worth.